All right, so this 321 through 326 is the central theme again, core concept of the book. God's righteousness has been revealed in Jesus Christ. Through Jesus Christ, we have salvation. Then in 327, he's getting ready to go into this next argument that is in full force in chapter 4, and it has to do with this an example of Abraham being the prototypical person who is righteous via faith, not by actions. So we're going to stay there for a while in chapter 4 and a little bit into chapter 5 with this concept now of Abraham, who Abraham is, what he does, and that it's first salvation comes to Abraham, or righteousness is accredited to Abraham via faith, not by anything else. Now the chapter, this is chapter 4. Chapter 4 breaks down this way. And so we're just going to kind of go as far as we can with this, and we'll see how far we get. But the issue here is that Paul is going to take Abraham as the example of righteousness via faith and not righteousness via works. So, but let's get into the text. So if somebody would read for us chapter 4, verses 1 through 5. Not all at one time, just...
Then what then shall we say was gained by Abraham our forefather according to the flesh? For if Abraham was justified by works, he has something to boast about, but not before God. For what does the Scripture say? Abraham believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness. Now to the one who works, his wages are not counted as a gift, but as his due. And to the one who does not work, but believes in him who justifies the ungodly, his faith is counted as righteousness. Okay, that's for the cataracts, so y'all next time speak.
I have some eye drops in my office if somebody needs some. All right, so we have you ever heard the term midrash? Does that ring a bell? You have? All right, wonderful. One person? We have two? Anybody else? Midrash is nothing more than a Jewish commentary, would be our version of a commentary. And what midrash, it's just a collection of teaching throughout the history of the Old Testament, normally sponsored or used by different rabbis. And Paul is using a midrash teaching to bring together two different texts here in chapter 4. The first one is the idea of Abraham accredited righteousness via faith. That shows up in Genesis chapter 15. And then Psalm 32, which is a psalm of David. And both of those texts are being connected by this whole concept of credited or reckoned unto him. And so it would be, it's no different than what John or myself do maybe in preaching or in teaching, where you take a text or two and then you give commentary, elaborate, explain it so that it has deeper meaning. That's what Paul is doing with these two texts, because they don't talk about the same subject. I mean, obviously, Psalm 32 is a psalm of David. David's writing about his own life. Now, obviously, there's a similar subject with God. And Genesis is talking about Abraham. They're not talking about the same people, but yet Paul is drawing both of those texts together and using them to explain this whole concept of justification by faith. Because if we were to go back and look at all of Abraham's life, we meet Abraham in, what is it? Is it Genesis 12? Is that it? Somebody want to stab at that? We meet him in Genesis 12, and at the very end of 13, he's mentioned via with his father. And then in Genesis 12, we have Abraham's call. And you have a couple of different chapters. And in Genesis 15, you have where God makes covenant with Abraham, all seen through the idea of God calling Abraham, Abraham believing, and then going. And so Abraham was made righteous not because he did all the things that he would eventually do that are tied to the covenant, and circumcision, believing in, and going to the different places. The fact that Abraham believed first and then did works is what Paul is drawing connection with in the text. Is that Abraham did not, his righteousness is not accredited him because he worked for it. His righteousness is accredited to him because God gives it to him, because Abraham believes, and there's the connection that we have to keep before us, because that's the argument that Paul's making in this whole chapter of chapter 4. Does that make sense? Gosh, it feels like I'm just talking in circles trying to explain that one, because there's a little bit of if we were to look at it in the Greek to English, you're probably going to have a fair amount of discrepancies between the different versions of the Bible. The text is hard to translate. There's a lot of words that could modify other words, but the key connection is that Paul is using this rabbinical teaching method to explain the passage of Genesis 15 and Psalm 32. And the key is that he's stressing how believers who are now part of this covenant of Abraham, for lack of better words, are part of this covenant not because of what they do with their flesh, circumcision. They are part of this covenant because they believe, faith. Does that make sense? All right. Good? All right. Fantastic. So, all right. So, and then when you have this commercial or business type metaphor where you see no one works. Look at verse 4. Now to one who works, wages are not reckoned as a gift, but something that is due. And so what Abraham received, he did not receive via work. It was a gift given to him. It's not a payment from God, but an unmerited gift that was freely bestowed to Abraham. Because some will argue that Abraham... Does anybody need this? I was going to erase it. Okay. So if you go back and look at... if you look at all the teachings that are associated with Abraham, there are some who would argue that because of Abraham, Abraham, he goes, travels, and then circumcision and all these other things that he does, that all that is somehow, because he did all that, that leads to righteousness before God. And so they argue that for those who follow in line with Abraham, it is what you do to be righteous with God. You've got to do certain things, sort of like climbing the stairs or a ladder. You start down here, and the more you climb up, eventually you get to a certain level. When you get to that level, then you're, welcome to the club. You're considered righteous. So there's a whole school of thought. Paul would not be in this because Paul is arguing the opposite, which is, one, you can't get high enough. And Abraham didn't start with works. He starts first with hearing a call from God and believing and trusting that he can follow this God. And then he does. And so when we go through chapter 4, you're going to see that this same analogy about Abraham being righteous via faith, he's going to apply that to Gentiles, to Jews, and then really to everyone inside of, because the requirement or what is needed for righteousness is not works, but anybody who believes. Salvation is is located not in the efforts of a human or in human efforts, but in a divine crediting or divine reckoning. Salvation emerges as an act of God, where God declares it. And there's a word that he uses that's only used here in Romans, that's actually for credited. It's my Greek's terrible, so I'm not going to try to pronounce it. Logizomai. Yeah, there we go. Is the word that is used there, and what it means is that God credits you because you believe, not because you do something. For Paul, what Paul is seeking to do is that Abraham has faith. Because he has faith, then he is justified before God, and then that leads to obedience. Others would want to argue that Abraham does something, and because he did it, he is justified, and then that leads to boasting. I did it. That makes sense? And so he's really, this whole concept of accrediting, the idea of God reckoning to the person, puts the whole work of salvation in the hands of God more than in the hands of a person. Which is, now, not to go back and rehash an old argument, but the idea of that whole concept of faith in Christ or faith of Christ, you can see that the whole faith of Christ, this would be one of the reasons why I kind of lean a little bit more in this camp, is because faith in, many would say that could be a work. I believe. But if it's a total gift and salvation is a gift from God, then faith of Christ, nobody can boast in that but Jesus. Right? So I'm not trying to go back and rehash this. Okay. Well, there's 7 times in the New Testament where the Greek is hard to interpret. The Greek, it's the word for faith, pisteo, and then the word for Jesus. And so, because they don't have prepositions in the Greek, or they don't have as many prepositions in the Greek as we do, they use what the word modifies, faith, could be faith in, or it could be translated faith of.
So then the faith of would be the faith of Jesus.
Right. That, ma'am?
What she said.
She said, so the faith of Jesus puts the faith is then referring to Jesus' faith. Right. So the faith of Jesus. If it's faith in Jesus, then it's referring to the person, the humans, their faith in Jesus.
I can't grasp that for whatever, it's just probably me, but it all has to start with a person's faith, right? If the person doesn't have a faith,
Right.
or whatever you want to call it, then
Well, what then saves a person? Is it their faith, or is it something that Jesus has already done, His faith? I'm asking the question. So at some point, they both have to connect, okay? So I don't want you to get hung up on it's 100% faith of Jesus or 100% faith in Jesus. I would argue, or I'm going to just tell you Shane's thoughts on this. It is the overwhelming majority, the faith of Christ. Hang with me for a second. What Jesus did on the cross and in the resurrection, that who Jesus is, what Jesus does, that opens the door for salvation for all of creation. Okay? Now, there has to be a point where it becomes first person. good Protestants as we are, right? And there has to be some level of, belief. How that shakes down, is it 99%, 1%? I don't know. We're heavy. Who we are, didn't matter where you grew up. I mean, this part of the church's history, particularly in the South, we are heavily influenced by evangelical theology. And not just evangelical theology, evangelical Billy Graham theology. You got to come and make a profession of faith, right? You probably have heard that, okay? And that's fine. That's great. But I mean, we're products of that, and we've lived in that type of environment now for, really since the 1930s. Now, Billy Graham wasn't 1930s preaching, but when you have in theology heavy influence in the middle 1800s by classical liberalism theology. That's it. Don't see liberal like left and right, but that's just the title that they called it, classical liberal theology. That said, sin's really not that big of a deal. There's really not a need for personal salvation as much because there's really not sin. Human beings are going to get better in every way, every day. And, what threw that on its heels was World War I. Because if people are supposed to be getting better and there's really not sin in the world, how do you explain something as terrible as World War I? Because that's the first time, think about it. It's the first time that it ever happened on that level. Well, what theologians did is they had to come to grips with, maybe there is personal sin, and that's a big problem. Maybe there's corporate sin, and that's a big problem. When I say corporate, not corporations, but just societal sin. And so out of that, you have the rise of what is called the neo-orthodox theology. Karl Barth, Bonhoeffer, all those guys. And what they did is they went back and said, no, for instance, Paul's writings, there's some problems with humanity. And the problem is we've fallen short of the glory of God. And so out of that came the rise of what would become evangelicalism. And so it's played out in the different seminaries, regardless of denominations. And so we've inherited that type of influence inside of the church today. How did I get on this? No, it's not.
Started a couple weeks ago.
Yeah,
Driving me crazy.
that's right. So the idea then is, so how does salvation work? If humanity is in need of salvation, we cannot save ourselves. We cannot fix ourselves. How does that work? Well, it's a gift first. Well, if it's a gift, then there's nothing a person can do. Even believing can be an act.
If you don't receive it.
That's right.
If you don't receive it.
Right, but before we don't worry about receiving it yet. By nature, the fact that salvation is a gift means that it first has to be accomplished in the hands of God. Faith of Jesus. Right? What do we believe when we say Jesus saves a person? Well, what do you mean by that? There's no wrong. What he did on the cross, shed his blood. We looked at some of those atonement issues. How does he do it? Well, Jesus does it. Well, the faith of Jesus, he accomplished the means by which salvation and forgiveness can take place. So don't worry about it getting to a person yet. The fact that it happened is solely a work of Jesus. Humanity had nothing to do with it other than to cause the problem. So God rectifies the problem through Jesus Christ. So whatever it is that Jesus accomplished, which is we call that salvation, imagine that as a giant vat of gold, all right, or wages, whatever it is. He mentioned wages, money. And God takes what is Jesus' gold or money, his wage, and he gives it to everybody else. Now they have to receive it, so then it does involve our faith, but it starts first with the faith of Jesus. Does that help? Is that better? Which means then it is ultimately a gift, first and foremost. Something that we receive. And so, which is different than I go and do it, perform it. And what I mean by that is, how much praying do you have to do to be a Christian? A lot? Or how much serving? Yeah, I mean, how much giving? You know, what do we say in the Methodist Church? Prayers, presence, gifts, service, and witness. So, how much prayers? How much service? How much gifts? How much do you have to do in order to be a Christian? All right. Well, there are some who say, maybe so. Now they don't actually say it, but that's really what they believe. I mean, you have people who, this is what I hear. God's been so good to me, I got to pay Him back. All right, what's that? The root of that? I've got to go. If I give this so much of my time, of my service, and all these things, eventually I'm going to get to that, whatever that number is, and that then I've proved to God I'm good enough, or lovable, or how many sins do you not have to commit? All right. Let's talk about it that way. If we're talking about righteousness, if I don't commit that many sins, then am I here compared to somebody else? And see, it gets really difficult, when we start to make comparisons of everybody in the same boat, and to stay with the World War analogies, that there really is no difference between me and Adolf Hitler. Or you and Adolf Hitler. Or whoever. What's the, who's the worst person in history? In your mind. Well, whoever that person is, put yourself right next to them, and that's the place where we're at. Now, it's okay. We, judging inside this room, that's not that big of a deal. We're all pretty good folks. But to see what's fully in play here is that we all have fallen short of this. And there's never a single or enough works that we can ever do that's going to somehow get us on the same par as righteousness. And so then there has to be somebody who is able to do that, and that somebody is Jesus. His faith, somehow opens up the door and satisfies whatever it is that needed to be satisfied, so that now there is an opportunity for people to have access again to God. Now we have to receive, and the idea of receiving it does stress the concept that we can't earn it. If I give you a gift, I give you a gift. There's nothing you can do that would say, well, I earned that gift. No, I didn't have to give you anything, or vice versa. So that's why I spend time on this faith of Christ, is for us to fully understand what's at play. It's easy inside of human nature to, when it comes to making comparisons to other people, does anybody play golf or tennis? All right. So if you're a golfer, most golfers, if you ask them about how they see themselves as a golfer, they see themselves as their best score. I'm dead serious. And or tennis, whatever. You have number rankings in tennis, like 1, 2, 3, 4, open or whatever. You see yourself as when you were playing your best tennis or golf or whatever it may be. You see somebody else as their normal score. Just telling you about sports psyche. All right. So, but we do the same thing with people. The people that are either like us or even ourselves, we we see ourselves in a different light than what we really are. But others who we think are worse than us, we see them, we think, very clearly. If you're going to first, you have to see yourself where you're at. And that's what he did in the first 3 chapters, is that apart from any, there's nothing that humanity can do, whether you're outside of the covenant or inside of the covenant, in the place where you start, you've still fallen short. And we will always be in a fallen short place category if it's not for someone who provides a means by which that state to change. And receiving that means does involve our faith, right? But receiving that means opens the door so that the state changes. Maybe not the behavior first, but the state of the person before God changes. Now, I like the word identity, how we see ourselves. That we don't use the word state, that much as a condition, which is why justification, first and foremost, is a legal term that involves a person's state. They are guilty, fallen, whatever it may be, but somehow, because of Jesus, they now have a different state, a different identity before God. Their behavior hasn't changed. They still, if we're looking at it in numbers of sin, they still have the same numbers of sin, but so they haven't done anything that would accredit them any level of righteousness, other than the fact that God is the one who gave it to them. So there's no reason, or there's no means by which anybody can boast or whatever it may be, because there's nothing to boast in. Does that make sense? So we can boast in this, but we definitely can't boast in that. Because Jesus provides a way for us, for all persons to have a place before God, their state to change, their identity to change. And what he's talking about in verses 1 through 5, through these different Old Testament concepts and passages with the person Abraham, is that Abraham is an example of a person whose state changed, not because he did something, but he believed. But it was a gift first and foremost from God. Now, because of that, he did do a ton of things. But it didn't start with doing them first. It started with just believing. And so he eventually, he's going to make this connection that because Abraham, as an example of what it means for their state to change before God as a gift, he now is the father to everyone, to use Old Testament language, not because they are inside an old covenant or not. He is the father of everyone who believes. You with me? So that's why Paul is, for three chapters, he set up the idea that everybody's in the same boat, and there's no way of getting out of that boat by their own means. And so the only way for us to get out of that boat, it requires an act of God, which is what we see in Jesus Christ. And now the door is open for someone to get out of the boat. Well, how did that happen? Because of Jesus. And Abraham is an example of someone who gets out of the boat by believing.
And it's all human beings.
Sure. I mean, she said, is it all human beings?
Receive the gift.
Yeah, the gift is universal, as in open to all persons. Now, whether or not all persons respond to that, I mean, that's debatable. If you're 100% in this camp, then it's like if Caroline invites some of her friends to come over and spend the night, and I buy them all dinner, then they just get it, So there are some, and And C.S. Lewis would be one, who, because of this being, so profound that that God deals with all of this, all the state, that everybody is given a gift, regardless if they've received it or not. All right, so those are eventually they end in a camp that we call universalists. That God, because of the glory of God and the love of God and the beauty of God, God accredits everybody's account. All they did is wake up one morning and they pull up their banking account and boom, there it is. They got a deposit. All right. Now I'm not telling you that's right or wrong. I'm just giving you where people are at. On the other side of that camp would be you got to. I mean, it's 100%. You got to believe, and nothing happens until you believe and profess faith and walk in that way. So those are just the inside of the church. Those are the two extremes. And if I had to guess, we probably are somewhere along this paradigm. I mean, everybody, like, if we were to take I don't know how many people's in here, 45 or so. If y'all were to come up here and put, all right, this is one extreme and this is the other extreme, where you're at, I mean, there would be 45 tick marks probably all over here, and probably more in this camp about right here. Being in the southern part at this time in our history, I mean, most of us would be right here, but there'll be a few over here and some probably over there. So does that make sense? Sure. Well, even though, that's right. And that's a good thing to have that. All right. So any questions? I know because this is important in going forward, at least in the study of Romans, is to see what Paul is doing with everybody is here, regardless of where they thought they started. They're still in the same boat. And the only way for the boat or the state of that to change is because of what God did in Jesus Christ. And because of that, now then there's a whole different ball game that's available for people because of Jesus Christ. Now, Abraham, and this is what he's doing, is he's teaching what's an example of someone who went from over here to here. I mean, imagine in a classroom. He's for 3 chapters he's taught about, here we are, this is how we get out of the boat because of what God has done in Jesus Christ. And so the question in the back of the room is, well, give me an example of that. Okay, Abraham. That's the logic of what he's doing in the book of Romans. And so for the next chapter or so, he's going to give an example of how Abraham didn't do this on his own, get out of the boat. He was able to move from here to here because he simply believed and trusted God. So God is the one who did it. If I started with that, it probably would have saved us about an hour, wouldn't it? What's that? Yeah, all right. So that's what she said is paraphrase the message. That's Eugene Peterson, I think, and said if there was another way to accomplish that, it would have been an Abraham story and not a God story, and that's pretty good. But there's all kind of terminology in the text that are unique to the book of Romans, where Paul is describing this God story, and that is drawing upon these 2 Old Testament passages, Psalm 32, Genesis 16, and then at the same time using concepts of working and receiving a wage compared to receiving something without working, to really frame the argument for for the reader. So let me pause before we go forward into verse 6. Feel pretty good about 1 through 5 so far? Okay. Well, if somebody would read 6 through 8, that doesn't have cataracts.
Makes it easier to understand.
AM EST also describeth the blessedness of the man unto whom God imputed righteousness without works, saying, Blessed are they whose iniquities are forgiven, and whose sins are covered. Blessed is the man to whom the Lord will not impute sin. Cometh this blessedness then upon circumcision only, or upon the uncircumcision also? For we say that faith was reckoned to Abraham for righteousness. He says here, or happiness. How was it then reckoned? When he was in circumcision, or is uncircumcision, not in circumcision, and he received the sign of circumcision, the seal of the righteousness of the faith which he had yet, being uncircumcised, that he might be the father of all them that believe, though they be not circumcised, that righteousness might be imputed upon them also, and the father of circumcision to them who are not of circumcision only, but who also walk in the steps of that faith of our father Abraham, which he has being yet uncircumcised.
All right. So what we have is a couple of different things in this. In 6 through 8 is where he draws upon the Psalm of David. And I think that's Psalm 32. And he connects that to Genesis 16, the story of Abraham. And the key, this connection piece, is that people are forgiven. In verse 7, blessed are those whose iniquities, you might have sins, are forgiven, and whose sins or iniquities are covered. And then in verse 8, blessed is the one against whom the Lord will not reckon sin. So what Paul is doing in the text is he's already stated this is where people are at, and they're there because of sin. To get over here into righteousness, they cannot do. And so what God has done is provided a means, and that through Jesus, sins are covered, are forgiven, and people end up over here. And he's connecting these two Old Testament heavyweights and some of their writing to explain that concept. And that would be a midrash teaching, if that makes sense. And then when he keeps on going in verse 9, then he talks about this righteousness by faith, which applies equally now to all persons. In the context of Romans, he's classified people as either a Jew or a Gentile. But this righteousness of faith now is applied to both Jew and Gentile, and the people of God are the people who believe, regardless of where they're at with relationship with the Torah or what level of ethnicity they might have. The new people of God are not people who are outside of the covenant or inside the covenant. Now the people of God are the people who who believe like Abraham did. They're now the righteous people, the people of God, and the qualification for that is for someone to have faith. And then in verses 11 through 12, he talks about this seal. I don't know if you remember, I probably should have went back and looked on what lesson it would be, where we talked about, I think it was in chapter 2, where, in chapter 2, Paul's talking about, you have people who, remember in the beginning of chapter 2, he's having this argument with this fictitious Jewish teacher. And in chapter 1, he lowers the boom on people who are outside of the covenant. In chapter 2, now he deals with people who are inside the covenant. And he starts with the idea that, you who are inside the covenant, you probably think you're in a pretty good place because you're not like the people of chapter 1. But be careful, because the things that you see wrong in chapter 1 with people, you have the same things as well. And he gives a list of those. And then he says, even you think that circumcision is this seal of righteousness in the fact that it's the symbol of what it means to be inside this covenant. Well, in chapter 4, what he is saying is that this seal of righteousness is not physical circumcision as much as it is circumcision of the heart. To use different language, people who believe. Circumcision was not the instrument for righteousness. Rather, circumcision was a seal of the righteousness of people who had faith. And the idea is that what makes them the people of God is that they believe, not because they have some seal or they have a card. Maybe that's a better way of talking about it. Let me pull out my membership card into the family of God. If you want to know, here it is, I give it to you. And what Paul is saying, there is no card that will ever be good enough for that. What it is that we, because of people are reckoned or accredited righteousness because God gives them righteousness through Jesus Christ. Now there might be things that come after that, but those are things that are secondary. The primary thing is that they have received righteousness from God. And in this case, since in Old Testament covenant, what was the symbol or the sign of being part of the Old Testament covenant? Circumcision, right. So he's dealing with that issue. He's addressing that there is, whatever the seal would be, the seal is nothing more than just a symbol of what should be first, which is faith, not works. All right? Good? Maybe? You ready for a break? All right, let's take a break. We'll take a break for 10 minutes or so. we'll jump back in and go try to get to the end of the chapter here in about 30 minutes. I think we'll be able to do it. So what I want us to do is look at verses 13 through 16. Says, "For the promise that he would inherit the world did not come to Abraham or to his descendants through the law, but through the righteousness of faith. If it is the adherents of the law who are to be the heirs, faith is null and the promise is void. For the law brings wrath, but where there is no law, neither is there violation." So I'm going to stop there just for a second and just touch on this. What he's talking about, maybe the best way to understand that whole faith in conversation is where does it start? So the idea is salvation. You know, where does salvation start? Does it start with an act of a person, act of people, or does it start with God? And what Paul has been arguing and is arguing now in chapter 4 is that it first starts with Jesus Christ. And since it starts there, then your theology is based off that. But if you start with an act of a person, then your theology will be based off that. Theology is just what we believe, or soteriology, what we believe about salvation. So what Paul is getting at in 13, 14, and 15 is that salvation doesn't start with the act of a person, and he doesn't use those actual words. He talks about it in terms of descendants of the law, the righteousness of the law, and because if it starts with an act of a person, then the person has got to be obedient to the law in order to be righteous, right? Well, I mean, if it does, if salvation is an act of a person, hypothetically, if it is an act of a person, then the person has to do things in order to be righteous. Well, what are the things that the person has to do? We know that from the law. So the person has to be obedient to the law. Well, if they can be obedient to the law, then they can be righteous. Right? But the problem is, what happens if they can't be obedient to the law? Then now they're under all the judgment that comes from the law, which is what he said in verse 15. For the law brings wrath, because it could also bring salvation if people could be obedient to it. But the fact that people can't be obedient to it, then that righteousness that has been revealed is experienced in wrath. Romans 1:18, right? Go back and look at Romans 1. Let's go back and look at Romans 1:16, 17. This is the whole thesis of the book. "For I am not ashamed of the gospel. It is the power of God for salvation to everyone who has faith, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. For in it the righteousness of God is being revealed." All right? So God has revealed himself, and in righteousness it's being revealed through faith for faith. That is written, the one who is righteous will live by faith. When we get to verse 18, that righteousness now becomes what? Wrath. Because if people could be obedient to the law, then it would lead to salvation or righteousness. But the fact that they can't, then it leads to wrath. So where we start when it comes to salvation makes all the difference in the world. But if we start with salvation being a gift from God through Jesus Christ, then it comes as a promise. Right? If I say to you, "Don't worry, I can accredit you, or I can reckon it to you, I can save you," so then the whole credibility of what's being offered sits with the person who's making the offer. Right? So you believe that God will be forgiving. Right? You believe that God would be loving or will be loving. I mean, how do you know if God's going to be forgiving or not? Have you seen the ledger? Well, I mean, but I'm serious. I mean, we don't really fully know until judgment, right? No, I'm not trying to. Just sit with me. I promise you. I'm making an argument. All right. So, you're right. We believe it. The fact that we believe it is we're believing in the promise of what's being offered. We don't know for sure. I mean, no one will know for sure until they face judgment. Right? No, I mean, no, but if you believe in the promise, then all of that sits with the person who's making the promise. I mean, that's what you ultimately believe. That's ultimately what Abraham believed. Genesis 12, pick up your suitcase and go. Where? I'll tell you. That's what Genesis 12 was about. Right? Pick up your suitcase and go. Where am I going to go? I'll let you know when you get there. And that's what he does. I want you to believe me that you're at some point your descendants are going to be like the stars in the sky, the sand on the beach. And what's Abraham respond? When's that going to happen? But he believes. I mean, they have a conversation, but I mean, but what he believed in the one who made the offer. And so salvation, since it starts with God as a gift, and we trust in that, that's what, I mean, the word believe, really probably a better word is trust. We trust in the fact that God offers salvation, and we trust in the fact that however great our sin is, that God is going to forgive it. I mean, you trust it now, and you trust it then. Sure, absolutely. Well, what's Hebrews 11 and 12 talking about? And that righteousness is by faith. And you actually have a laundry list of these heroes of people who are righteous. Do you know who's in the list? You got some no-nos, let me tell you. They're not the poster boy or girl for being perfect. But they believed. And they believed in the promise of what was offered. Now, the promise is not worth 2 cents unless it's coming from someone who can make good on what is being offered. Which means it's a gift. And so where we start determines how we see salvation working. And if we start it with that it is something that begins with a person, they can do it, then it ends with righteousness is something that has to be accomplished. Well, that's good until you realize you can't accomplish it. So then, what is it? Well, you're then held accountable to what it says, wrath. I mean, if Connor tells me, Dad, I'm going to fill out. Can't believe I'm going to say this. I am going to fill out that Georgia application. And we go. Yeah. But he's already been accepted to Auburn. So, and Alabama of all things too. So, if he tells me last night as I text him before I go to bed, which is, son, I want the application completed. We can't do any more until you go in and do your part. I'll do it. Okay. Well, he's made a promise. I've made a promise. Now, if he doesn't do it, then he lives into what comes with that, which won't be wrath, but it might not be pleasant, So, where we start is important, and what Paul is beating the table with in chapter 4 is that it starts, this whole concept is because people are sinful, salvation is not a human action, is where we start. It starts first with God. God has revealed Himself in righteousness. We see that in Jesus Christ. We trust in the promise of what God says He will do, so we believe. And Abraham is the example of that. For whether or not people are inside the old covenant or outside of the old covenant, Abraham is the example of what it's like for a person to be a child of God because they trust in a promise, not in something that they do first. So maybe I hope that's helpful, more helpful. If faith means nothing if the promise is worthless, right? I mean, if you're trusting that, if I say, hey, I'll take care of it, and you say, well, Shane's going to take care of it, I'm not going to worry about it, and I'm going to go on about my day, and it's just an empty promise, then you're trusting in something that is worthless. But if you're trusting in one who can do it, then faith becomes a means by which a person experiences righteousness. So where you start, or where salvation starts, is important. So we get to verse 16, for this reason. Anytime we see the word for, that means he's substantiating what was said. For this reason it depends on faith, in order that the promise may rest on grace and be guaranteed to all his descendants, not only to the adherents of the law, but also to those who share the faith of Abraham. For he is the father of us all. As it is written, I have made you the father of many nations. In the presence of the God in whom he believed, he gives life to the dead and calls into existence the things that do not exist. Now, this is talking about what God does. This is talking about that promise. All right, so what Abraham believes in the promise. Well, what's the promise? The promise is that God justifies or accredits righteousness to people who are dead. Here, sin, and God as an act of God's will does this in the presence of God in whom He believed. This is back in verse 17. Who gives life to the dead and calls into existence the things that do not exist. Hoping against hope, he believed that he would become a father of many nations, according to what was said, so numerous shall your descendants be. This goes back to that whole concept of Abraham is trusting in a promise from the person who's going to make it good. That it's not something that Abraham can do on his own, that he's simply trusting in what God offered to him. He did not weaken in faith when he considered his own body, which was already as good as dead. Now, Paul's being a little facetious here because he's talking about Isaac. And I, as my grandmother would say, Abraham was not a spring chicken. So he had some age on him, for he was about 100 years old, or when he considered the barrenness of Sarah's womb. No distrust made him waver concerning the promise of God, but he grew strong in his faith as he gave glory to God, being fully convinced that God was able to do what he had promised. There sits the core. He's trusting in a promise of the one who gave the promise to him, that he would make good on the promise that was offered. And that is the example for us. We're trusting in a promise. We're trusting in a promise that God will be gracious. We're trusting in a promise that God will forgive. We're trusting in a promise that God will be merciful, and that God would sustain, care, and even things that are dead, God calls back to life. You with me? All right. So therefore, this is verse 22. Therefore, his faith was reckoned to him as righteousness. All right. Because Abraham trusted in the promise, God then reckons to Abraham righteousness, even though he was not by action a righteous person. Right? Same thing with us.
It seems to me that Abraham was believing the promise that he would become the father of many nations, not that that his belief was accredited to him as righteous.
All right, so let's go back and look at Abraham and his life. When we meet Abraham, he's living in Iraq, Ur. And what most people believe about Abraham is that his dad is some type of a priest, but he's polytheistic. And so, Abraham has some level of religious practices in his life. So here sits Abraham. He hears from God a promise to go. All right? So he goes. And he goes because part of this promise is, you go, serve me, now I'm paraphrasing, and I'll make you a father of many nations. All right? So the idea of a father of many nations is tied up to the promise that God offered. But did Abraham just decide to go and then at some point said, I'll be the father of many nations by my own actions? Or did he trust that God would guide and lead that? Which one?
He trusted God.
Right. So he is trusting in that in a promise that he will be the father of many nations. But who is he trusting? God. That's right. Right. He's trusting God. He's trusting in God. And from that, he will become a father of many nations. Okay? What Paul is doing is saying that Abraham trusted in a promise that he could not do in his own self. He's 100. And Sarah, we don't give her age in this text, but 10 years, all right, so she's 90. All right, so not in the childbearing age. But he's trusting in the fact that it would happen. And what makes Abraham righteous is not that he has a child, or that Sarah has a child. What makes Abraham righteous is that he trusted God to fulfill the promise. Does that make sense? You still look a little...
It seems straining.
It seems what?
It seems straining.
Yeah, well, keep in mind, this is Paul using a midrash teaching of a text in Genesis chapter 16, which is Abraham trusted God, and so therefore he's righteous. And so he's given commentary, laying it out bit by bit. But the idea is that Abraham is considered righteous not because they have a child. He is considered righteous because he believes. Now, Paul is talking about salvation as a whole. Abraham, he's using a scene in Abraham's life of just trusting in having a child. So to your point, Abraham in Genesis 16 is not talking about salvation for the entire world or for the cosmos, for all of history. He's just following.
Well, and it was bothering me that Abraham doubted enough to have Ishmael.
Right.
And so that was part of Sarah. I didn't want that to be.
Yeah, well, the issue was that, now what happens, that even proves Paul's point even more. Because Abraham is considered righteous because he trusted in a promise, not because he got it right all the time.
Yeah.
All right, so he obviously gets it wrong when it came to Ishmael as being part of the father of many nations, and he definitely got it wrong when he went to Egypt. Because what's he do in Egypt? He lied. That's exactly right. That's one of the big ones, right? Yes, it is. Number 9, don't bear false witness. So, Abraham is not perfect when it comes to righteousness, as in I don't have sins or I'm as holy as God is. That's what righteous would mean. Abraham is not. He has got issues when it came to his behavior, his action. He commits sins. But God accredits, gives to him righteousness, even though he is not righteous. Just like God, and Paul, when he begins his letters, he addresses people who are not fully righteous, right?
That's why he brought David into this.
Yeah, well, David, yeah, that's a whole different lesson on David.
But he has David's song
That's right. And David would be another example of someone who made multiple mistakes, sins, whatever word, iniquities, whatever word you want to put to that. But yet, David is considered righteousness because he believed, just like Abraham, just like us. And so Paul, when he addresses every church in the New Testament, how does he address them? To the saints. And then you read the letter, and they're not saints. I mean, they've got issues, but God accredits, gives to them, reckons them to be righteous, because it starts with God, and not something that we do. Now, the doing comes after, but it starts first with trust, hope. I believe, or I trust in a promise that God would be this way. Now, there's evidence in chapter 5, we're going to see that part of that trusting, God implants into us His Spirit, which seeks to create a certain type of character and virtue or nature. We just haven't gotten there yet. So the action and the doing will come, but the doing is not first. The trusting is first. Abraham did do things, but he trusted first. And so what Paul is making in this comparison, this midrash teaching, is that Abraham is righteous not because they had a child, or not because he did certain things. Abraham is righteous because he trusted in a promise. Does that make sense? And so what makes Abraham then, in Paul's language, a father to all, is that people trust along the same lines. Well, if Abraham believes in a promise, and that leads to righteousness, and if we believe in a promise, then surely that would lead to righteousness too, right? Right? So that's what Paul's laying out in this teaching. All right. Any other comments or questions around Abraham? So verse 22, therefore his faith was reckoned to him as righteousness. Now the words, it was reckoned to him, were written not for his sake alone, but for ours. There's what we were just talking about. It will be reckoned to us who believe in him who raised Jesus our Lord from the dead, who was handed over to death for our trespasses and was raised for our justification. So there you see Paul laying out this promise. The promise is that God will forgive. God will be gracious, merciful. God will justify. And by trusting in that promise, we experience then the righteousness of Jesus Christ. Even if we're not at this very moment righteous on our own account by what we've done. That comes later. All right? Good? Maybe you want to go back to the state of humanity? Probably not, huh? All right. Any comments or concerns, or if anything's just not clear, or maybe a question that you might have? All right. Any announcements? We didn't do any of that when we started. We just kind of ran right into it, didn't we? All right. Well, go in peace. May the Lord be with you.